This record is filed pursuant to Directive 81 of the Vethanu Signal Compact, subsection on the permanent decommissioning of passive monitoring assets. The station identifier is VORATH-7. The filing officer is ORATH-7, signal warrant, grade 4, assigned to this post for the last 19 of the station's 41 operational years. The equipment will be powered down in 6 hours. The record will be sealed on closure and transferred to the Compact's deep archive at Thesavar Station, where it will join the 41 annual logs already filed by my predecessors and by me. I'm not required to file anything beyond the standard inventory audit and the equipment status report. I have completed both. What follows is a supplementary personal record, filed under the discretionary provision of Directive 81 that allows a retiring monitoring officer to append observations of operational significance. I use that provision deliberately. I have 19 years of observations to set down, and the 6 hours before shutdown are sufficient. I will be precise. I was trained to be precise. That training is, in the end, the only reason I am filing this record and not a much shorter one. VORATH-7 was established 41 years ago as a passive signal monitoring post at the outermost edge of the Vethai's prohibited corridor. Its purpose, as defined in the founding charter, was to record, classify, and archive any electromagnetic or subspatial signal activity emanating from within the prohibited zone or detectable at the corridor's boundary, without transmitting, without crossing the boundary line, and without in any way acknowledging the monitored signals to their source. The last clause is the critical one. I will return to it many times. The station has no weapons. It has no propulsion. It was never designed to do anything except listen. I arrived 19 years ago from the Signal Compact's training facility on Veth Station Prime, where I had spent 4 years learning the taxonomy of frequencies, how to read a waveband the way a cartographer reads a contour line, how to date a signal's origin by the scatter pattern of its propagation, how to distinguish interference from intent. I was 26 years of standard age, and I had never been posted anywhere classified. VORATH-7 was my first assignment above Grade 2 clearance, and I was told before I shipped out that it was a quiet posting. Long watches, minimal contact with the Compact's central offices, a small rotating staff of 4, and the kind of extended solitude that either broke a signal officer or made one. They were right that it was quiet. They did not tell me what the quiet would contain. I should explain the geometry of the post. VORATH-7 sits at the outermost fixed marker of the Vethai's corridor's prohibited designation, a point in space that was established by the Compact's boundary survey teams 412 years ago as the furthest extent of passive monitoring that the Compact's founding charter authorized. Beyond this point, in the direction of the prohibited zone, no Compact vessel has been authorized to travel. Before the station was built, the boundary was maintained only by navigational exclusion, a line on the chart that ships were required to treat as a hard wall. VORATH-7 was established to turn that line from a prohibition into a practice, to maintain a continuous watch at the wall itself, so that any signal emerging from beyond it would be noted and archived. The founding charter uses the word watch 11 times in its 5 pages. I have counted. The word is doing real work in that document, more work than the legal drafters likely intended it to do. A watch is not a scan. A scan is automated, periodic, calibrated to return data at intervals. A watch is continuous and human and present. The charter requires both. The passive array runs continuously, and the officer sits beside it, and the officer is there when the data changes in ways the automated system has not been programmed to recognize. This distinction matters. I will return to it. In 41 years of operation, the station recorded 417 signal events from inside the prohibited zone. 389 of those were cataloged under classification row passive, ambient propagation, signal wash, the ordinary electromagnetic residue of a volume of space that contains stars, gravitational bodies, and whatever else the zone contains. The remaining 28 were catalogued under classification sigma-directed, signals with measurable intentionality markers, coherence, directional focus, repeating structural patterns that could not be accounted for by ambient sources. Of those 28 sigma-directed events, 5 occurred during my 19-year tenure. I was the receiving officer for all 5. I filed the reports for all 5. I maintained the discipline of non-acknowledgement for 4 of them. The 5th was different. I will come to it. The first sigma-directed event I received came in my 3rd year at the station. I had by then settled into the rhythm of the watch, 4 officers rotating in 8-hour segments, the passive array running continuously, the logging system processing the ambient noise into its overnight summaries, and the occasional spike of coherence that required a human officer to pull the data and make the call on classification. Most spikes resolved to row passive on review. The instruments were sensitive enough to catch structured patterns in stellar wind, in the crystalline harmonic resonances of certain asteroid fields, in the interference patterns between overlapping propagation fronts. The training at Veth Station Prime had been thorough on this point. Apparent intentionality was common. Actual intentionality was rare. The first event was unmistakable. It arrived at the station's long-range passive array at 04:17 station time on a morning I had been asleep for 2 hours. The duty officer, Thurin Voss, my senior colleague at that posting, 17 years in the compact and 12 of them at Vorath 7, pulled me from my bunk not because the regulations required it, but because he had been watching the incoming data for 40 minutes and he did not want to be alone with what he was seeing. I remember sitting down at the secondary monitor beside him and looking at the waveform analysis. I remember the quality of the silence in the room before either of us said anything. The signal was transmitting in the compact's standard diplomatic contact frequency range. Not in the compact's frequency specifically, not tuned to the exact protocols, not using any of the recognized contact codes, but in the range. The frequency band that any civilization capable of interstellar communication would understand by long custom to mean, I am attempting contact. I am not a weapon. I am a voice. The directional focus was precise. The signal was coming from inside the prohibited zone, and it was aimed at Vorath 7. Thurin and I sat with it for 6 hours. We watched it cycle. The pattern was not complex. A coherent pulse strain, structured in groups of varying length, with intervals between groups that themselves contained a secondary pulse sequence at lower amplitude. The primary sequence repeated on a consistent period. The secondary sequence did not repeat. It developed, incrementally, with each cycle of the primary. Whatever was generating the signal was not broadcasting a fixed message. It was building one. At hour 6, Thurin filed the sigma-directed report and I initialed it as witnessing officer. Neither of us had transmitted anything. Neither of us had adjusted the passive array's orientation in a way that could be interpreted as responsive. The regulations on this point were unambiguous. A passive monitoring post does not respond. It records. The signal continued for 9 hours after we filed the report. Then it stopped. I have thought about those 9 hours many times in the 19 years since. The signal was building something, a message, a model, a structure of meaning that had not yet been completed when it stopped. I do not know what the completed structure would have looked like. The archived record at Veth Station Prime contains 412 cycles of the primary sequence and a secondary sequence that advanced through 63 distinct states before the transmission ended. The Compact's Signal Analysis Division reviewed it, filed an assessment of probable artificial origin with high confidence, and noted that the secondary sequence's final state appeared to be a functional grammar, the bones of a language, or something language adjacent, incomplete by approximately 40%. They recommended continued passive monitoring. They did not recommend response. I agreed with the recommendation. I still agree with it. I want to be clear about that. Because what I am about to describe might seem, in retrospect, like the behavior of someone who had doubts. I did not have doubts. I had the data, and the data told me what the regulations already said. You do not respond. You record. You wait. You maintain the discipline. The discipline is the post. The post is the discipline. I understood this then. I understand it now. The second Sigma-directed event came 7 months later. It was briefer, 42 minutes, a single coherent pulse train with no secondary sequence, directionally focused on the station. The frequency was the same contact range band. The pattern was different, shorter, less structured, more like an inquiry than a construction. Like something asking, "Did you receive the first transmission?" We recorded it, we filed, we did not respond. It stopped after 42 minutes and did not recur. I want to note something about the 7 months between the first and second events, because the interval itself was information, and I treated it as such at the time. 7 months is not a random duration. It is long enough that a reasonable observer might conclude the first transmission had been received and considered. It is short enough that the follow-up could not be called impatient. The timing had the character of a professional courtesy, the kind of interval you allow before sending a second inquiry when you are uncertain whether the first arrived. 7 months of patience, and then a single quiet question. Did you hear me? The third event came 11 months after the second. A different frequency, not the contact range band this time, but a subspatial carrier wave that the compact's instruments were not originally designed to detect. Thurin noticed it first, on the anomaly channel, where it registered as what the automated system classified as interference. He pulled the manual analysis and found the structure underneath the carrier. The same primary-secondary pulse architecture as the first event, compressed to fit the subspatial medium, but identifiably the same grammar, advanced from the 63% completion point where the first event had ended, building forward. It was not a new signal. It was the continuation of the first one, sent by a different route because the first route had gone unanswered. We recorded it, we filed, we did not respond. Thurin took leave 3 weeks after the third event. He had 19 years in total at the post by then, and he had requested transfer 4 times in the previous 2 years. The transfer was approved on the 5th request. I did not ask him before he left whether the third event had been the deciding factor. I did not need to ask. I had watched him at the monitor for the 48 hours after the third event's final transmission, and I had seen a man doing arithmetic that did not resolve to a comfortable answer. He left. I filed the report for his departure. I filed the request for a replacement officer. The replacement arrived 8 weeks later. Sethan Var, 22 years old, just out of training, no prior postings above grade 1. I gave Sethan the orientation brief, showed her the station systems, walked her through the classification protocols. I told her that Vorath 7 was a quiet posting. I told her this the way it had been told to me because it was still true. The quiet was what it was. What it contained was what it had always contained. I did not tell Sethan about the 3 Sigma-directed events. I want to explain that decision, because I know how it reads and I want to be precise about what it was and what it was not. It was not deception. The event reports were in the station log, accessible to any officer with grade 2 clearance or above. Sethan had grade 2 clearance from her first day. The information was available to her. I simply did not hand it to her in the first week. I made a judgment, and I stand by it, that the orientation period was not the right moment to introduce the most complex material in the station's record. A new officer needs the fundamentals before she can hold the exceptional. You build the baseline first. You read the 389 row passive events before you try to understand the 28 Sigma-directed ones. You learn what silence ordinarily contains before you try to interpret what it occasionally delivers. This is not a policy. It was my judgment, made in good faith, for a specific officer at a specific moment. She found them on her own, 4 months in. She came to me with the archived reports on a morning when the watch was quiet and the array was returning nothing but ambient, and she set the files on the console between us and sat down and looked at me and did not say anything until I nodded. Then she said, "What do you think it was?" I told her I thought it was what the report said it was, a probable artificial origin signal from inside the prohibited zone, structured with apparent communicative intent, received and recorded in accordance with the station's protocols. She said, "Do you think it was the humans?" I said that the prohibited zone was designated human space, and that any signal activity originating from within the zone would, by definition, originate from within the zone's primary designated territory. I said that the compact's classification system did not require us to speculate further than that. She said, "But you think it was them?" I did not answer that question. I found other work to do. Sethan was a careful officer. In the 3 years we shared the watch, she developed what I can only describe as a professional relationship with the event archive, not an obsession, not a preoccupation, but a habit of returning to the files during quiet watch periods with the attitude of a scholar revisiting a primary text. She never proposed a theory she could not support with the data. She never added interpretive notes to the logs that went beyond what the signal taxonomy permitted. But she asked questions. She asked them precisely and she asked them consistently, and she did not accept the answer that an event could be filed and concluded simply because the transmission had stopped. For Sethan, the stopping was as interesting as the sending, and the interval between events was as much a part of the data as the events themselves. I learned from her in that way. I had been a good technical analyst before Sethan. I became a better one after her because she trained me to read the gaps. The 4th Sigma-directed event came 2 years after the 3rd in my 6th year at the station. It was the simplest of the 4, a single coherent pulse, 2.4 seconds in duration in the contact range frequency band aimed at Vorath 7. No secondary sequence. No grammar structure, no apparent ongoing construction. I was on watch when it arrived. Sethan was in her bunk. I pulled the data and ran the analysis and sat with the result for 11 minutes before I filed the report. A single coherent pulse of 2.4 seconds carries very little information. In the compact's own contact protocols, a signal of that duration and structure would be classified as a handshake marker, an acknowledgement. The lowest level message in the recognized contact vocabulary: "I am still here. I am still watching. I know you are watching too." I filed it as Sigma-directed. I did not add interpretive notes to the file beyond the standard technical analysis. I woke Sethan and showed her the data after the filing was complete, because she deserved to see it, and because I did not want to be alone with what I was thinking. She looked at the data for a long time. Then she said, "It knows we're here." I said that a directed signal required a known target, and that Vorath 7 had been at this location for 22 years at that point, and that the station's passive array emitted a navigational identification pulse on the standard frequency as required by compact charter, and that any sufficiently sensitive detection apparatus within range would have been able to locate the station from that pulse alone. She said, "So it's known we were here since the beginning." I said, "At minimum." She said, "And the first 3 signals were addressed to us." I said, "The directional data supports that conclusion." She sat with that for a while, then she said, "What do we do?" I said, "We record, we file, we continue the watch." She looked at me with an expression I have spent time trying to categorize in the 19 years since and have not fully succeeded. It was not fear. It was not skepticism. It was something more like the look of a person who has been handed a problem that has already been solved and is only now understanding the shape of the solution, understanding it from the inside, the way you only understand it when you are the one who has to live with the answer. She said, "All right." She was a good officer. I want to take a moment here, in this decommissioning record, to say something about the discipline of non-acknowledgement that I have referenced several times already. It is not a passive thing. I want to be clear about that. People who have not stood a watch at a monitoring post, people who have read the founding charter and the classified briefings and the standard orientation materials, sometimes imagine that non-acknowledgement is simply the absence of an action. You do not transmit. You do not respond. You sit on your hands. This imagining is wrong. Non-acknowledgement is active. It is a choice that must be remade, deliberately, every time the data comes in. It is a choice that has a weight to it, a specific measurable weight that compounds over time, and that sits differently in the body at the end of a 4-year posting than it did at the beginning of one. I know this because I have carried it for 19 years, and I know the difference between the weight at year 1 and the weight at year 19. Year 1, the weight is a rule. Year 19, the weight is a scar. I do not say this to complain. I say it because the record should be accurate, and the accurate record of a monitoring post is not only the signal logs. It is also the account of what it costs to maintain the discipline that the logs depend on. You do not get the 41 years of clean row passive and sigma-directed records without the 41 years of officers who sat in the quiet and made the choice over and over again, sometimes with a 2.4-second pulse arriving in the dead of station night, sometimes with a 48-hour construction of alien grammar building on the passive array, always with the same answer: record, file, hold. I held. We held. I should account for the years between the 4th and 5th events, because they were not empty years, and the record should reflect that. After the 4th event, Sethan requested transfer. I was not surprised. She had been at the post for 3 years, and she had the grade and the time in service for a standard rotation request, and 3 years at Vorath 7 with 4 sigma-directed events in the archive is a different experience of the post than 3 years at a quieter station. I signed her transfer request and filed it, and did not append any notation about the events. The Compact's assignment office approved the transfer. Sethan shipped out 6 weeks later. She did not say much in the weeks before she left. She did her watch hours, she filed her logs, she maintained the equipment. She ate her meals and slept her rotation and did the work. On her last day, she came to find me in the monitoring room and stood in the doorway for a moment before she said anything. She said, "Do you think they'll send another signal?" I said I didn't know. She said, "If they do after I leave, I'd like to know, in the archive, just that it happened." I said I would make sure the event report was filed correctly, as it always was. She said, "I know. I just wanted to say that I want to know." I said I understood that. She left. I have not seen her since. I do not know where she was posted after this. Her name is in the station's personnel register, as every officer's name is. It is a clean record, no disciplinary notations, no unusual incident filings, no gaps in the watch logs. She was there and she did the work and she left, and the record reflects that with the accuracy a good officer earns. The officer who replaced her was Vorath Selm, a senior analyst, grade 3, who had previously served at 2 other monitoring posts, and who arrived with no apparent curiosity about the station's event history and no apparent desire to develop any. He read the archive in his first week, as required. He filed the confirmation that he had reviewed the sigma-directed events as required. He asked no questions. He did his work. He was competent and professional, and he treated the station like a posting rather than a question. He served 3 years and rotated out. I have no particular account to give of those 3 years beyond the standard record: ambient noise, row passive classifications, no sigma-directed events. The corridor was quiet, and he kept the watch quietly, and that is a complete account of a signal officer doing exactly what the charter requires. After Vorath Selm came Thesavel, who was young and precise and asked good technical questions, and worked through the sigma-directed archive with the thoroughness of someone building a reference model rather than investigating a mystery. She mapped the 4 events against each other, drew the frequency progressions, charted the interval durations, and produced a working analysis document that sat in the station's shared files for her entire 3-year rotation, and that I used more than once to orient later arrivals. Her analysis was accurate and professionally bounded. She drew no conclusions the data did not support, and I found her approach instructive. She left without ceremony, transferred to a deep space relay station in the Compact's outer network, and I believe she has done well there. After Thessavel came Doreth Alm, who was quiet and methodical and read everything and said little, and after Doreth Alm came Voreth Am, who will be directly relevant to the 5th event, and who I will introduce properly when we reach that point. Each of them served their rotations and did their work and rotated out. I was the fixed point. I was the one who stayed. 19 years. 5 colleagues who came and went, not counting Thur and Voss who preceded me. 416 signal events in the archive under my tenure, with 4 of the 28 lifetime Sigma-directed events logged in my name before the 5th arrived. And then the 5th. Voreth Am, the officer who directly preceded Veril, requires proper introduction because his contribution to this record is technical rather than narrative, and the technical contribution matters more than almost anything else in the 41 years of this station's history. He was a systems analyst by primary training. Signal taxonomy was his secondary qualification, earned as a postgraduate credential rather than a primary course of study, and he arrived at the post in my 15th year with a methodical irritation with the station's software infrastructure that I came to appreciate deeply over his 3-year tenure. He was not a dramatic person. He did not announce his conclusions before he had evidence for them. He did not argue with the existing system in the way that younger officers sometimes argued, with the energy of someone trying to prove their superiority to what came before. He simply looked at the protocols with a systems analyst's eye and identified a gap. And then he described the gap with the precision of someone who had found a structural fault in a load-bearing wall and felt a professional obligation to report it accurately. His complaint, which he filed formally in his 2nd month, was that the station's differential analysis protocols were calibrated to detect signal events as point source phenomena, something transmitting from a location, aimed at a receiver, arriving through a conventional medium. The protocols were excellent at this. They had correctly classified all 4 Sigma-directed events that had arrived before his tenure. They had never missed a directed transmission. They were not, on the evidence, failing at their stated purpose. His complaint was that the protocols would not catch a signal that was not a point source phenomenon, a signal that arrived through the behavior of the medium itself, that was distributed rather than directed, that could only be detected by comparing the full ambient profile against a long-term baseline, would resolve to noise in the current system. It would be filed as a row-passive artifact and forgotten. He was right. I had not thought of it before he raised it, and once he raised it I could not stop thinking about it. The first 3 Sigma-directed events had all been point source transmissions. The 4th had been a handshake marker, also point source, aimed and delivered on a standard frequency. There was nothing in the 4-event archive that suggested the prohibited zone would change its approach. But the archive was 22 years old at that point, and 22 years is not a long baseline for an entity capable of the patience demonstrated in the intervals between the first 4 events. What the zone might do in the next 22 years was not something the 4-event archive could predict. I authorized the software modification work in his 2nd year. He spent 14 months building the altered ambient detection capability into the differential analysis layer and calibrating it against the station's existing ambient baseline, all 41 years of it, because the baseline was what gave the differential its resolution. And a shallow baseline would catch only gross perturbations rather than the subtle ones. The result was inelegant by the compact standards. It was a custom addition to a standard system, not an officially sanctioned protocol update. But it worked. We tested it against archive data and against simulated ambient inputs, and it performed correctly. Voreth filed the modification report, received a technical acknowledgement from the Compact's infrastructure division, and was told the modification would be reviewed for potential inclusion in a future software update. He rotated out at the end of his third year. He left no particular ceremony. He packed his materials, submitted his final watch log, shook my hand in the equipment bay, and shipped out. I did not know, at the time of his departure, that what he had built would be the instrument that caught the most significant signal event in the station's 41-year history. The review was, to my knowledge, still pending when the fifth event arrived, 3 years into Verrill's tenure, and it remained pending when I filed my review of the transition plan 6 years after that. Voreth software caught the fifth event. I want that in the record, plainly. The capability he built, at his own initiative, on the basis of a gap he identified without being asked to identify it, is the reason the fifth event exists in this archive at all rather than in a row-passive folder-marked instrument noise. One officer's methodical irritation with an imperfect system is the margin between 41 years of records that make complete sense and 41 years of records that contain the truth. Verrill was on watch when it arrived. I was asleep. He had been at the post for 14 months, a young officer, thoughtful, technically precise, not easily unsettled. He had read the station's complete event history in his first week, which was the correct and thorough thing to do, and he had come to me afterward with questions, and I had answered them as completely as I could without drifting into interpretation. He knew the 4 Sigma-directed events. He had their timestamps and their technical parameters in his working memory, the way a navigator holds the known hazards of a charted route. He had also read the Voreth modification report, and he had run the altered ambient detection layer in its active monitoring mode from his first week, which not every officer before him had done. He woke me at 02:31 station time. He stood in my bunkroom doorway with a tablet in his hand and an expression that I recognized, the Southern expression, the one I had not fully been able to categorize for years. I had a better handle on it by then. It was the expression of a person who has just understood what the scar actually represents, who has moved from knowing that a thing happened to knowing what it means that it happened. He said, "There's something on the long-range array." I said, "Sigma-directed." He said, "I don't know what to call it." I got up and went with him to the monitoring room and sat down at the primary console and looked at the incoming data, and I understood immediately why he didn't know what to call it. The signal was not in the contact range frequency band. It was not in the subspatial carrier, wave that the third event had used. It was not in any frequency that the station's passive array had been designed to monitor, and the array had been upgraded 4 times over the station's history, and its coverage was broad. What Verrill had found was a signal that was arriving at the station through a propagation medium that did not appear in the Compact's instrument taxonomy. The instruments were detecting it only because it was affecting everything else. It was not being received directly. There was no receiver for it. It was being inferred from the behavior of every other signal the array was tracking. The entire ambient noise profile of the station's monitored volume had changed, subtly, in a pattern that, when the Voreth differential analysis layer ran the comparison against the archive baseline, resolved to a coherent structure. The thing was not transmitting at us. It was altering the medium through which everything else was transmitting, and the alteration was the message. I sat with the data for a long time. Verrill sat beside me and neither of us spoke. The structure that emerged from the differential analysis was not the grammar from the first transmission, the one that had been building through the first and third events. It was something simpler. It was, in the vocabulary of the Compact signal taxonomy, a locator acknowledgement, the signal equivalent of a position marker. The kind of transmission a vessel makes when it has found what it was looking for and wants to confirm the location to its own record. Not, "I am trying to contact you." Not, "Do you receive me?" Not, "Here is a message I have constructed for you." Just there you are. The signal lasted 37 seconds. Then the ambient noise profile returned to baseline. I filed the report. Verrill initialed it as witnessing officer. The Compacts Analysis Division at Veth Station Prime processed it in 11 days and filed a response that I will summarize as follows. The event is noted. The propagation medium appears novel. The structural analysis is assessed as inconclusive. Continued passive monitoring is recommended. The response took 11 days. By then, I had read the differential analysis approximately 40 times. I had memorized the shape of the 37-second structure. I had laid it against the archive of the previous 4 sigma-directed events, and I had read what was there to read, and what was there to read was not complicated. The first 3 events were transmissions, messages built and sent and unanswered. The 4th event, the 2.4-second pulse, 11 years before the 5th, had been an acknowledgement, a handshake marker, the lowest possible message, I know you are there. The 5th event was a response to the 4th. Not immediate, 11 years is not immediate by any standard, but a response. The 4th event had said, I know you are watching me, and 11 years later the 5th had said, yes, and we know that you know, and we have known since before the watching began, and we are content for now with the record as it stands. 37 seconds, there you are. I spent a long time, weeks, in the aftermath of the 5th event, trying to determine how I felt about this. I want to be careful here, in the record, because I know how the rest of this reads and I want to be precise about the sequence of my understanding. The first thing I understood was the geometry. The 4th event had been received 11 years before the 5th. If the 5th event was a response to the 4th, and the structural analysis supported that reading, then either the response had traveled at a speed that allowed an 11-year delay, or the 5th event had not originated 11 years ago but had been held, somewhere between origin and destination, for a duration calibrated to the 4th event's timeline. Either interpretation was consistent with the data. Neither interpretation required anything I would call supernatural. What they required was a degree of patience and precision that had no equivalent in anything the Compact's monitoring infrastructure had ever documented. The second thing I understood was the implication of the 5th event's propagation medium. The altered ambient approach, threading a message through the differential behavior of the entire monitored volume rather than transmitting directly, was not a technique for contact. It was a technique for observation. You use the altered ambient method when you want to leave a signal that a specific instrument can detect, but that cannot be traced back to a point of origin by any conventional means. It is, in the signal taxonomy, the equivalent of a footnote left in someone else's archive, visible to the reader, invisible to the archivist. They had left a footnote in the ambient noise of the Vethai's corridor's outer boundary, addressed to the station, confirming the station's location, confirming that the station had been located for some time. I am not going to state in this record whether the 5th event changed my assessment of the discipline of non-acknowledgement. I have already said that I stand by the discipline. I stand by it. I will continue to stand by it. What I am going to state is that after the 5th event, I understood the discipline differently than I had before. Before, I understood it as a rule built on caution, on the recognition that an unknown entity in the prohibited zone was unlikely to receive a first contact well, and that the correct position for a monitoring post was to observe rather than to announce. This is what the founding charter says in its original language, and it is a reasonable reading. After the 5th event, I understood the discipline as something the monitored party had also arrived at, from the other side. They had not responded to the first transmission with a counter-transmission. They had not escalated when the station failed to answer. They had not crossed the boundary to examine the station directly. They had sent a second message, and a third, and a fourth, each one calibrated in its own way, different frequency, different medium, different structural complexity, and each one had ended without response from us, and they had not treated that non-response as hostility. They had treated it the way we treated their signals, as data, as information about the entity on the other end of the channel, as something to be recorded and incorporated and held. The fourth event, the handshake marker, 2.4 seconds, I know you are there, that one we had sent. We had not intended it as a transmission. The navigational identification pulse that Vorath 7 emits as required by Compact Charter, the one I told Sethan about when she asked whether the prohibited zone could locate the station, that pulse is not a message. It is a bureaucratic requirement, a kind of cosmic address plate, and it had been emitting continuously for 22 years at the time of the fourth event, and it has continued to emit for the 19 years since. But the differential analysis of the fifth event's response was precise. Its structure matched the navigational identification pulse's own timing markers. The response had been calibrated to the pulse, not to any of the Compact's 3 intentional transmissions in the first through third events, all of which we had filed as unanswered. To the pulse, the one we had never thought of as a transmission at all. They had heard us before we heard them. I want to set down, for the record, that I reviewed the founding charter of Vorath 7 3 times in the months after the fifth event, and found nothing that contradicted the station's operation. The charter establishes a passive monitoring post at the outer boundary of the prohibited zone. The charter requires continuous operation of the navigational identification pulse on the standard frequency. The charter prohibits transmission, response, or boundary crossing. The station has done none of those prohibited things. The station has operated as designed and as directed. I have no fault to find with the charter, and I have no fault to find with the station. What I have is the fifth event in the archive, and the 41 years of ambient records that the analysis division will inherit when this post goes dark, and the understanding, which I am setting down here because it will not fit in a standard event report, that the 41 years were not one-directional. We have been monitoring the prohibited zone for 41 years. We have been aware of the zone for that duration. The zone has been aware of the station for at least that long, and possibly, given the precision of the first transmission's timing, which arrived in year 3 of the station's operation and was addressed to the station by name, using the navigational pulses identifier, for as long as the station has existed. Possibly longer, if the zone's detection capabilities extend to the survey vessels that selected this location and to the construction teams that built the post. The founding charter's authors conceived of a one-way mirror. We watch. They do not know they are watched. This conception was, I believe, made in good faith on the basis of available information. It was also incorrect. I do not know when the error became the record's property, but it became mine 11 years ago, and I have carried it since, and now I am leaving it in the archive where it belongs. I said earlier that I would address my decision not to respond to the fifth event. I want to do that now, because this is the section of the record that matters most, and I want to be precise. When the fifth event ended, 37 seconds of altered ambient, there you are, and then silence, Veril, and I sat in the monitoring room for a long time. The instruments returned to their baseline readings. The ambient noise settled back into its familiar patterns. The array went on collecting data as it always did, as it was built to do. Veril said eventually, "What do we do?" I said, "The same thing we always do." He looked at me. He had the Sethan expression, fully developed now, the understanding the shape of the solution expression. He said, "Even knowing what we know." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" And I said something that I want to include verbatim in this record, because I have not said it to anyone since, and because it is the closest I have come, in 19 years, to explaining the weight of the discipline to someone who was still at the beginning of it. I said, because the 4 events before the fifth went unanswered, and the fifth arrived anyway, not as a threat, not as an escalation, not as a demand, as a record, the same way we record. They looked at us the way we look at them, and they found what we found, which is a station that watches and doesn't cross and doesn't answer, and they confirmed our location and left the confirmation in our instruments and went quiet again. That is not the behavior of something that needs us to respond. That is the behavior of something that knows the value of the record for its own sake. If we break the discipline now, if we transmit, if we signal back, if we try to open the channel that 5 events have built and left open, we are no longer a monitoring post. We are something the charter doesn't cover. We are something without established protocols. We are improvising at the boundary of the prohibited zone, and the charter exists precisely because improvisation at the boundary of the prohibited zone is how you build a record that someone has to clean up later. Verrill was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "And if they signal again?" I said, "Then we record it, we file the report, we hold the discipline." He said, "For how long?" I said, "I don't know, as long as the station runs." He said, "And after the station?" I said, "That's in the archive. That's what the archive is for." He went back to his bunk. I stayed at the console for the rest of the watch, running the passive array, listening to the ordinary silence of the corridor's outer boundary, noting the ambient readings, filing the routine log entries that make up the vast majority of a monitoring post's record. No further signal events occurred. I want to note for completeness that Verrill served his full 3-year rotation and rotated out without incident. He was, as I said, a thorough and precise officer. His logs were clean. His event reports for the 5th Sigma-directed event and for the 37 months of routine watch that followed were accurate and professionally filed. He did not request early transfer. He did not add interpretive notes to his reports beyond what the protocols required. He did his work and he left. I asked him on his last day whether the 5th event had changed anything for him. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "It changed what I thought the silence was. Before, I thought the silence was absence, the zone not talking to us. After, I understand the silence is a conversation, just not the kind that requires words." I said I thought that was right. He left, I stayed. The years that followed Verrill's departure were the quietest of my tenure. No Sigma-directed events. The ambient logs accumulated their row passive records and the array ran, and I kept the watch and filed the annual reports and maintained the equipment through 2 officers, David Sorn and then Kelev Orath, who were competent professionals and who read the Sigma-directed archive with the careful attention the records deserved and who came to me, each in their own time with variations of the same question, and who received from me the same answer I had given Sethen and Verrill. We record, we file, we hold. David and Kelev both served their rotations fully. Neither requested transfer. By the time of the decommissioning notice, 3 years before the shutdown date, I was the only officer in the station's 41-year history to have been present for all 5 Sigma-directed events. That is not a distinction I sought. It is simply what 19 years of staying produces. The station is being decommissioned because the Compact's Boundary Assessment Division has determined, after a review of 41 years of Vorath 7's records, that a fixed passive monitoring post at this location is no longer the optimal use of the Compact's signal infrastructure resources. The division's report, which I have read in full, notes the 417 signal events in the archive, acknowledges the 28 Sigma-directed classifications, and assesses the station's operational contribution as significant, but its continued marginal yield as low. The prohibited zone remains prohibited. The corridor remains closed. The monitoring function will be maintained going forward by the Compact's long-range distributed array at Veth Station Prime, which covers the corridor's outer boundary from a distance of 14 standard sectors. The distributed array is sensitive. It is, by the Compact's own specifications, more sensitive than Vorath 7's dedicated instruments for most of the frequency ranges in its coverage profile. What it does not have is the altered ambient detection capability that Voreth built into the station's differential analysis protocols in my 15th year. That capability is Voreth 7's. It will not transfer to the distributed array automatically. The Compact's transition plan includes a software package derived from Voreth protocols, but the derivation process took 18 months, and the result, which I reviewed at the Compact's request 3 years ago, is a partial implementation, functional for broadband differential analysis, but calibrated to a different baseline, one that was established at Veth Station Prime rather than at this location. The fifth event was detectable from this station because this station had 41 years of local ambient data as a baseline. The differential was subtle. On the distributed array's calibration, it would likely have resolved to instrument noise. I included this assessment in my review of the transition plan. The review was accepted. The transition plan was not modified. I do not know what the Compact's Boundary Assessment Division made of my review. I do not know whether the altered ambient detection gap was considered significant or marginal in the final resource allocation decision. I know that the decision was made, and that it was made by people with access to the full record, and that the record includes the fifth event and its analysis and my review of the transition plan. I have done what a monitoring officer can do, which is to observe, to record, and to file. The decisions belong to the division. 3 sectors inward from Voreth 7's position, a commercial trade consortium has applied to the Compact's Boundary Review Board for authorization to establish a passive signal monitoring array in the outer Vethis corridor for the purpose of identifying potential communication frequencies that might support future commercial engagement with the prohibited zone's designated territory. The application has been under review for 14 months. I became aware of it 6 months ago through a routine Compact Communications digest. The application is, to my knowledge, still pending. I have not filed any comment on the application through the Compact's review process. I am a monitoring officer, not a policy officer. The review board has access to Voreth 7's complete 41-year archive. The 5 Sigma-directed events are in that archive. The 5th event's analysis is in that archive. My supplementary observations from year 11 are in that archive, and this decommissioning record will be added to the archive when the station closes in 4 hours and 6 minutes. The record is complete. The information is available. What the review board does with it is not my function to determine. I want to close this record with something other than the standard inventory notation, and I want to be honest about the difficulty of finding the right words for it. I have spent 19 years at a listening post. I am better at receiving and classifying than I am at transmitting. The supplementary provision of Directive 81 asks for observations of operational significance, and I have filed those observations, and what is left is something harder to classify. Thurin Voss, who was at this station for 12 years before I arrived, and who handed me the watch on my first day with the specific, deliberate plainness of a man who had already worked out what the watch required. Thurin used to say that the post's real job was not to listen but to stay. Any instrument listens. Only an officer stays. Staying is the job that can't be automated, because staying is a choice that has to be made again every day, and it has to be made by something that understands what it's choosing. I stayed. I stayed through 4 Sigma-directed events, and the long quiet between them and the 5th event that rewrote what the quiet meant. I stayed through Sethan's departure, and Voreth Seln's departure, and Thessa Vels, and Doreth Alms and Voreth Alms, who built the software that caught the 5th event, and Verils, who named the silence correctly on his last day, and Daviths and Kellavs, who kept the watch after. I stayed while the corridor remained closed and the zone remained prohibited, and the navigational identification pulse emitted its continuous address plate signal into the dark, and whatever was in the dark received it and did not acknowledge that it received it, and then, in the 11th year of my tenure, acknowledged it in a medium we barely had the instruments to detect calmly, without apparent urgency, 37 seconds and a footnote in the ambient noise, and then silence again. I do not know what is in the prohibited zone. I know it is old, older than Vorath 7, older than the corridor designation, older than the founding-era cartographers who drew the boundary line that this station sits beside. I know it has been aware of the station's existence from at earliest the third year of operation, and at latest the first day, and that awareness has not translated into escalation or interference or any behavior inconsistent with patience. I know that the 4 messages it sent, in year 3 and year 4 and year 5 and year 11, were all addressed specifically to the station and all went unanswered by us, and that the response to our failure to answer was to send a different kind of message. Not a demand, not a warning, but a confirmation. A record. There you are. I found over the years that this was the part of the 5th event I kept returning to. Not the propagation medium, not the calibration to the navigational pulse's timing markers. The 3 words the structure resolved to in the compact signal analysis vocabulary for locator acknowledgments. There you are. Not why won't you answer, not we will come to you, not you are forbidden, not any of the things that a warning or a threat or even a genuine contact attempt would say, just the locator acknowledgement, the position confirmed, the record updated. Whatever is in the prohibited zone had looked at this station for 41 years, had received 4 unanswered transmissions, had tracked the navigational pulse through 11 years of silence after the 4th event, and the response it had chosen to send was not a message in any direction. It was an entry in a log. It was doing what we were doing, and it wanted the station to know that. I have made peace with not knowing what that means in the large sense, what it implies about the nature and age and patience of whatever generates those signals from inside the zone. I have not fully made peace with the altered ambient detection gap in the transition plan, or with the consortium's pending application 3 sectors inward, or with the knowledge that the navigational identification pulse will continue to emit from this unpowered station for 14 to 18 months after shutdown, into a dark that the distributed array cannot correctly hear. I have not fully made peace with the fact that 19 years of this work, 19 years of holding the discipline, of reading the gaps the way Sethan taught me, of maintaining the baseline that Vorath OM software needed in order to function, ends tonight, in this room, with an inventory audit, and a set of sealed files transferred to an archive that may or may not be checked by anyone with the particular formation of skills and patience required to understand what the 5th event actually said. But making peace with things outside my authority is not the post's job. The post's job is to observe, to record, and to hold the discipline. I have held it. The equipment will begin shutdown in 4 hours and 1 minute. I will complete the standard inventory audit notation, file this record as the supplementary attachment to the decommissioning report, and remain at the console until the passive array goes offline. I will be the last officer at this station. After the array goes offline, the station will drift on its current orbital path at the outer boundary marker, unpowered, and the compact's recovery team will retrieve it in approximately 8 weeks for decommissioning and recycling of its components. The navigational identification pulse will continue to emit until the power cells are exhausted, which the technical specifications estimate at between 14 and 18 months from shutdown. For 14 to 18 months, Vorath 7 will continue to announce its position at the outer boundary of the Vethai's prohibited corridor. It will not listen. It will not record. It will not classify anything it receives. It will only transmit the one signal it was always required to transmit. I am here. Here is my identifier. Here is my location into the corridor's outer dark, to whatever is listening on the other side. I do not know whether anything will answer. I know the archive will not be there to receive it if something does. I close this record. The station's watch ends with this filing. Whatever the watch was watching, Whatever it was that sent 5 signals into the corridor's outer boundary and received 5 silences in return and found in those silences not an absence but a conversation, I leave it to the archive to carry. The archive is what persists. The archive is what the discipline was always for. I dim the console, the array runs on. The silence holds in both directions, as it has always held, and one of those directions has understood it longer than we have.